Picture this: a king who collects books by day and skins his enemies alive by night. A ruler who builds the ancient world's greatest library while simultaneously burning entire cities to ash. That was Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, who reigned from 668 to 627 BC. He was a walking contradiction, a scholar who could read ancient Sumerian texts, and a warrior who boasted about making necklaces from the severed heads of his enemies. Today, we're going to explore how one man could embody such extremes, and why his reign marked both the peak and the beginning of the end for the Assyrian Empire. Early life and unexpected succession. Ashurbanipal wasn't supposed to be king. He was born around 685 BC as the younger son of Esarhaddon, who ruled the Assyrian Empire at its greatest territorial extent. His older brother, Shamash-shum-ukin, was the natural heir. But in the ancient world, birth order was just one factor among many. Ashurbanipal received an education that was extraordinary even for royalty. While most Assyrian princes learned warfare and administration, he studied cuneiform script, mathematics, and the ancient Sumerian and Akkadian languages. Inscriptions from his reign tell us he could read tablets from before the Great Flood, texts that were already ancient when he was born. He learned the art of divination, studying the movement of stars and the patterns in animal entrails to predict the future. He wasn't just literate, he was a genuine scholar in an age when most kings couldn't write their own names. But his father Esarhaddon had a problem. The Assyrian Empire stretched from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, and it was becoming too large for one man to manage effectively. In 672 BC, Esarhaddon made an unusual decision. He would split his inheritance. Shamash-shum-ukin would become king of Babylon, the empire's second city and a constant source of rebellion. Ashurbanipal would rule Assyria proper and hold supreme authority over the entire empire. This arrangement satisfied no one. The Babylonians saw it as Assyrian domination in disguise. Shamash-shum-ukin would be king in name only, always subordinate to his younger brother. And Ashurbanipal? He would spend much of his reign proving he hadn't gotten the throne through political maneuvering but through genuine capability. When Esarhaddon died in 669 BC during a campaign in Egypt, the transition happened smoothly, at least on the surface. Ashurbanipal was crowned in Assyria, and his brother took the throne in Babylon. But the seeds of future conflict were already planted. The Egyptian campaigns. Ashurbanipal's first major test came quickly. Egypt, which his father had conquered just a few years earlier, was in open revolt. King Taharka of the 25th dynasty saw Esarhaddon's death as an opportunity to reclaim Egyptian independence. He had support from local Egyptian princes who resented Assyrian rule. In 667 BC, Ashurbanipal marched south with his army. The campaign was brutal and efficient. He captured Memphis and pushed Taharka south into Nubia. But Ashurbanipal did something his predecessors often failed to do. He learned from experience. Instead of just installing puppet rulers and leaving, he established a more permanent Assyrian administrative presence. He garrisoned troops in key Egyptian cities and appointed Assyrian officials to oversee tax collection and report on any signs of rebellion. It didn't work. Within a year, Taharka's successor Tutankhamun launched another rebellion. This time, Ashurbanipal's response was devastating. In 663 BC, his forces marched all the way to Thebes, the ancient capital in Upper Egypt and one of the most sacred cities in the Mediterranean world. What happened next shocked the ancient world. The Assyrian army sacked Thebes. They looted its temples, carrying away gold, silver, and precious stones. They broke open royal tombs and stole the treasures of pharaohs who had been dead for over 1,000 years. The destruction was so complete that the event was still being talked about decades later. The Hebrew prophet Nahum would later reference the fall of Thebes as proof that no city was invincible, not even Assyria's capital of Nineveh. But here's where we see Ashurbanipal's complexity. While his army was destroying Thebes, he was also ordering scribes to copy Egyptian texts and send them back to Nineveh. He wanted their knowledge, even as he demolished their power. This wasn't mindless destruction. It was calculated subjugation paired with intellectual curiosity. The Library of Ashurbanipal. Now let's talk about what might be Ashurbanipal's greatest legacy, though he probably didn't intend it to be. Around 650 BC, he began assembling a collection of texts in his palace at Nineveh. This wasn't just a king's personal library, it was a systematic attempt to gather all human knowledge into one place. Ashurbanipal sent scribes throughout his empire with orders to copy every tablet they could find. He wanted medical texts, astronomical observations, mathematical treatises, omens, prayers, hymns, and myths. He collected administrative records and royal correspondence from previous kings. He acquired the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish creation myth, and countless other works that would otherwise have been lost forever. The library eventually held somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 tablets. Scholars still debate the exact number. To put that in perspective, it was larger than most medieval European libraries would be 2,000 years later. Ashurbanipal organized these tablets by subject and created what might be the world's first library catalog system. But why? Why would a king who spent half his time on military campaigns dedicate such resources to copying old texts? Part of it was practical. Medical texts helped his physicians. Astronomical observations helped predict eclipses and other events that might be interpreted as omens. Administrative records from previous reigns provided precedents for legal decisions. But there was more to it. Ashurbanipal genuinely believed that knowledge was power. In several inscriptions, he boasts about his literacy, not his conquests, but his ability to read. He writes that he can decipher complicated cuneiform signs, that he understands texts written before the flood, that he has mastered scribal arts that most scholars find difficult. For a warrior king in the brutal world of ancient Mesopotamia, this focus on intellectual achievement is remarkable. There's also a darker interpretation. By gathering all these texts into one place under his control, Ashurbanipal was monopolizing knowledge. He was ensuring that the wisdom of conquered peoples couldn't be used against him. Control information, control power. It's a principle as old as civilization itself. The Elamite Wars. If Egypt defined the first part of Ashurbanipal's reign, Elam defined the middle. The kingdom of Elam, located in what's now southwestern Iran, had been a rival of Assyria for centuries. The two powers had fought on and off for generations, with neither gaining permanent advantage. Around 655 BC, tensions flared again. The king of Elam was harboring Assyrian rebels and providing support to various anti-Assyrian factions throughout the region. For Ashurbanipal, this was intolerable. He launched a series of campaigns against Elam that would last nearly a decade and result in some of the most savage warfare of the ancient world. The Elamite Wars were different from his Egyptian campaigns. This wasn't about installing puppet rulers or extracting tribute. Ashurbanipal wanted to destroy Elam as a political entity. His army devastated the Elamite countryside, city by city. They cut down orchards, poisoned wells, and salted agricultural land. They burned temples and smashed statues of Elamite gods. In 647 BC, Ashurbanipal's forces captured Susa, the Elamite capital. What followed was systematic destruction on a massive scale. The city was looted and burned. The royal tombs were opened and the bones of dead Elamite kings were carried back to Assyria, the ultimate insult in a culture that placed enormous importance on proper burial and ancestor worship. Ashurbanipal's own inscriptions describe the aftermath with disturbing pride. He writes that he made the land of Elam silent, that he destroyed its cities so thoroughly that no one would know where they had stood, that he scattered salt and thorns over the ruins. Archaeological evidence suggests he wasn't exaggerating by much. Susa was so completely destroyed that it would be centuries before the site was reoccupied. But the human cost was even more staggering. Prisoners of war were treated with shocking brutality. Ashurbanipal's reliefs and inscriptions describe enemies being impaled on stakes, flayed alive, or having their tongues torn out. Nobles who had opposed him were forced to pull his chariot like animals. In one particularly grim passage, he describes making a necklace from the lips of rebels and hanging it around the neck of a defeated king. We need to be careful here. These inscriptions were propaganda designed to terrify potential rebels and glorify Ashurbanipal's power. Some historians argue that he exaggerated the brutality for effect, but even accounting for hyperbole, the Elamite Wars represented warfare pushed to its most extreme conclusion, the attempted erasure of an entire people. The Babylonian Civil War. While Ashurbanipal was occupied with Elam, tensions with his brother were reaching a breaking point. Shamash-Shumukin had ruled Babylon for nearly 20 years, and he was tired of being subordinate to his younger brother. The Babylonians were tired of it too. They saw themselves as culturally superior to the Assyrians and resented being treated as a conquered province. Around 652 BC, Shamash-Shumukin decided to act. He formed a coalition with several of Assyria's enemies, including some Elamite factions and Arab tribes to the south. Then he declared his independence from Assyrian authority. It was civil war, brother against brother, with the future of Mesopotamia hanging in the balance. The war lasted 4 years and devastated Babylonia. Ashurbanipal's forces surrounded Babylon and laid siege to the city. They cut off food supplies and waited. Inside the city, conditions became nightmarish. Ancient sources describe people eating grass, leather, and eventually each other. The siege was one of the most brutal in ancient history. In 648 BC, Babylon fell. Shamash-Shumukin died in the flames of his own palace. Whether by suicide, murder, or accident, the sources disagree. Ashurbanipal showed no mercy to the rebels. Mass executions followed. According to his inscriptions, he had rebel leaders flayed alive and displayed their skins on the walls of Babylon as a warning. But here's where Ashurbanipal's political intelligence shows through. Once the rebellion was crushed, he didn't destroy Babylon. He understood that Babylon was too important, too wealthy, too culturally significant to eliminate. Instead, he installed a puppet king and integrated Babylonia more firmly into the Assyrian administrative system. He rebuilt temples, restored trade routes, and even continued sending tablets to his library that contained Babylonian texts. He could separate his scholarly appreciation for Babylonian culture from his political need to dominate it militarily. The civil war had another consequence that Ashurbanipal probably didn't anticipate. It weakened the empire significantly. The 4 years of fighting had drained resources, depleted the army, and destroyed agricultural production in Babylonia. The empire had won, but it was exhausted. The Arab campaigns. During and after the Babylonian Civil War, Ashurbanipal also conducted campaigns against various Arab tribes to the south and west. These campaigns are less well documented than his wars in Egypt or Elam, but they reveal another aspect of Assyrian warfare, the ongoing struggle to control trade routes and nomadic peoples who didn't fit into the empire's administrative system. Arab tribes controlled key caravan routes across the desert. They also had a reputation for harboring refugees and rebels from Assyrian territory. Around 645 BC, Ashurbanipal launched a series of raids deep into the Arabian desert. These weren't campaigns of conquest in the traditional sense. You can't really conquer nomads who can simply move away. Instead, the goal was to punish, intimidate, and extract tribute. The campaigns were marked by the same brutality that characterized his other wars. Inscriptions describe the slaughter of men, women, and children, the capture of camels and livestock, and the destruction of desert oases. One inscription claims he made the desert run red with blood and piled up corpses until they blocked the caravan routes. Again, we should read these claims with skepticism. Desert warfare was difficult and often indecisive. Arab tribes could retreat into areas where Assyrian armies couldn't follow, but the campaigns did achieve their goal. They disrupted anti-Assyrian activities in the region and demonstrated that even the desert provided no refuge from Assyrian power. Ashurbanipal, the Scholar King. Throughout all these military campaigns, Ashurbanipal maintained his identity as a scholar. This wasn't just propaganda, it was genuine. In reliefs from his palace, he's shown not just in the traditional royal scenes of hunting and warfare, but also in quieter moments, sometimes surrounded by scribes and tablets. He personally supervised the organization of his library. He specified which texts should be copied and how they should be organized. Some tablets bear notes in his own handwriting, or at least that's what the inscriptions claim. Whether he actually wrote them himself or dictated them to scribes, the point remains. He was deeply involved in the intellectual life of his court. His medical texts included prescriptions for hundreds of ailments. His astronomical tablets recorded observations going back centuries. His collection of omens, the Assyrian and Babylonian equivalent of fortune-telling, was the most comprehensive ever assembled. Future scribes would continue to reference Ashurbanipal's library for centuries after his death. There's a psychological puzzle here. How do you reconcile the man who carefully preserved ancient wisdom with the man who boasted about piling up severed heads? Was he a hypocrite, a sociopath, or was he simply a product of his time and place, where scholarship and savagery weren't seen as contradictory? The ancient Mesopotamians didn't separate these qualities the way we might today. A good king was expected to be fierce in war and wise in peace. Ashurbanipal was fulfilling both roles, perhaps too well. His cruelty served a purpose. It terrorized enemies and prevented rebellion. His scholarship also served a purpose. It legitimized his rule and connected him to the ancient traditions of kingship. But there might be something else going on. Some historians have suggested that Ashurbanipal's intellectual pursuits were a form of compensation. He hadn't been raised expecting to be king. He'd been educated more like a priest or scribe than a warrior. When he took the throne, he had to prove himself through military success. But he never stopped being the scholar prince, and his library was his way of maintaining that identity, even as he waded through blood to keep his empire together. The royal hunts. One activity bridged Ashurbanipal's scholarly and martial sides. Lion hunting. Royal lion hunts were a tradition in Mesopotamia going back thousands of years. They were highly ritualized events that demonstrated the king's strength and his role as protector of his people from dangerous animals. But Ashurbanipal took lion hunting to a new level. The reliefs from his palace at Nineveh show these hunts in extraordinary detail. Lions are released from cages into an enclosed area. The king, sometimes on foot and sometimes in a chariot, kills them with spears, arrows, and even his bare hands. The artistry is stunning. You can see the muscles of the lions tensing, the expressions of rage on their faces, the moment of death captured in stone. These weren't wild hunts. They were staged events, carefully orchestrated for maximum drama. The lions were captured beforehand and kept until the hunt. The king's safety was never really in danger. Archers surrounded the arena, ready to intervene if needed. But that wasn't the point. The point was to demonstrate royal power over nature itself. Ashurbanipal is shown as calm, almost casual, as he dispatches lions. In one famous scene, he pours a libation over the bodies of dead lions, honoring them even as he kills them. In another, he holds a dying lion by the jaw, looking directly into its eyes. It's intimate and brutal at the same time. These reliefs served multiple purposes. They demonstrated physical courage and strength. They connected Ashurbanipal to legendary heroes like Gilgamesh, who had also fought lions. They showed that he had mastered not just human enemies, but nature itself. And they provided spectacular entertainment for visiting dignitaries who would see these scenes and understand that opposing Assyria was as futile as a lion opposing Ashurbanipal. The decline. For all his military successes and cultural achievements, Ashurbanipal's reign ended in mystery and probable chaos. The last dated inscription from his reign is from 631 BC. After that, the historical record becomes frustratingly vague. We know he died around 627 BC, but we don't know how. There's no record of a great funeral or elaborate mourning period, unusual for a king who had ruled for over 40 years. What we do know is that within 2 decades of his death, the Assyrian Empire collapsed completely. In 612 BC, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes besieged Nineveh. The city fell after a 3-month siege. It was destroyed so thoroughly that within a few generations, people had forgotten where it had stood. The great library burned. Thousands of tablets were baked hard by the flames, which ironically preserved them for modern archaeologists to find 2,500 years later. Why did the empire collapse so quickly? Ashurbanipal had left it militarily strong and territorially intact. Part of the answer lies in the very things that made his reign successful. The brutal wars of conquest and suppression had created enemies throughout the region who were waiting for any sign of weakness. The centralization of power meant that when weak successors took the throne, the entire system became vulnerable. There's also the matter of succession. Ashurbanipal had at least 2 sons, and they apparently went to war against each other after his death. Civil war erupted just as it had during his own reign. But this time, there was no strong king to restore order. The empire fragmented and fell apart. Some historians have argued that Ashurbanipal's reign itself contained the seeds of destruction. The campaigns against Elam and Babylon had been too brutal, creating permanent enmity. The empire had grown too large to be managed effectively. The military had been overextended for too long. When crisis came, there were no reserves of strength or goodwill to draw upon. The archaeological rediscovery for over 2,000 years, Ashurbanipal was forgotten. Nineveh became a mound of dirt in northern Iraq. The great library was buried under rubble and sand. The Assyrian Empire itself was remembered mainly through biblical references, and those weren't flattering. That changed in the 1840s when British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard began excavating at Nimrud and Nineveh. What he found amazed the Victorian world. Massive sculptures of winged bulls, reliefs showing ancient warfare in shocking detail, and tablets, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets covered in cuneiform writing. When scholars began reading these tablets in the 1870s, they found treasures that revolutionized our understanding of the ancient world. They found the Epic of Gilgamesh, which contains a flood story that predates and probably influenced the biblical account. They found Babylonian creation myths, mathematical texts, astronomical observations, and medical prescriptions. They found royal inscriptions that named kings, described battles, and dated events. And they found Ashurbanipal's own words, his boasts about his cruelty, his pride in his scholarship, his detailed descriptions of campaigns and conquests. The man who had tried to erase Elam from history had ironically ensured his own immortality by preserving these texts. The lion hunt reliefs from his palace are now among the most famous works of ancient art in the world. They're displayed in the British Museum, where they continue to astonish visitors with their power and artistry. The dying lion, mortally wounded but defiant until the end, has become an iconic image, a reminder of both the cruelty and the artistic achievement of the ancient world. Modern scholars have a complicated relationship with Ashurbanipal. On one hand, without his library, we would know vastly less about ancient Mesopotamian civilization. The texts he preserved are our primary sources for understanding Babylonian and Assyrian culture, religion, literature, and science. On the other hand, his inscriptions reveal a level of brutality that's shocking even by ancient standards. The historical legacy. So what do we make of Ashurbanipal? Was he a cruel tyrant or an enlightened patron of learning? A brilliant strategist or a lucky heir to his father's achievements? A complex individual or a product of his brutal age? The answer is probably all of the above. Ashurbanipal was a man of genuine contradictions, not just someone who played different roles. He really was a scholar who loved ancient texts and spent resources preserving them. He really was a warrior who commanded brutal military campaigns and boasted about his cruelty. These weren't opposite sides that he kept separate. They were intertwined aspects of how he understood kingship. In the context of ancient Mesopotamia, his behavior wasn't unusual. Assyrian kings had been using terror as a tool of statecraft for centuries before him. The difference was that Ashurbanipal was better at it than most, and he left more detailed records. His inscriptions don't hide the brutality, they celebrate it, because from his perspective, cruelty served a legitimate political purpose. It prevented rebellion, maintained order, and protected his people from external threats. His scholarly pursuits were also about power, just a different kind. By preserving ancient texts and mastering ancient languages, he was connecting himself to the deep past of Mesopotamian civilization. He was claiming legitimacy not just through military might, but through wisdom and continuity with ancient traditions. The library wasn't separate from his military campaigns. It was another way of asserting dominance and establishing his place in history. There's a tragic irony to his story. He worked so hard to preserve knowledge and secure his legacy, but within a generation of his death, his empire was gone. The civilization he represented was destroyed so thoroughly that for thousands of years people thought the biblical descriptions of Assyria were exaggerated myths. The library that was supposed to preserve wisdom for all time burned in the flames that consumed Nineveh. But in another sense, he succeeded beyond his wildest expectations, because those tablets survived, baked hard by the very fire that destroyed the city. Ashurbanipal gave us an invaluable window into the ancient world. We can read the Epic of Gilgamesh because he had it copied. We understand Babylonian astronomy because he preserved those observations. We know about ancient medicine, mathematics, and religion because of his obsessive collecting. And we know about Ashurbanipal himself, his pride, his cruelty, his learning, his complexities. He wanted to be remembered as the greatest king of Assyria. He got his wish, though probably not in the way he imagined. He's remembered not just as a conqueror, but as a contradiction, proof that human beings have always been capable of both great wisdom and terrible cruelty, sometimes in the same person. Outro: the story of Ashurbanipal raises questions that are still relevant today. Can we separate a person's cultural contributions from their moral character? Should we celebrate the preservation of knowledge even when the person who preserved it committed atrocities? How do we judge historical figures who lived in times and places with fundamentally different values than our own? These aren't easy questions, and there are no simple answers. What we can say is that Ashurbanipal was the last great king of a dying empire. He pushed Assyrian power to its absolute peak, and then watched it begin to crumble. He was a scholar and a monster, a preserver and a destroyer. He represents both the highest achievements and the darkest aspects of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. If you found this exploration interesting, let me know in the comments. Do you think Ashurbanipal's cultural contributions redeem his brutal military campaigns, or are they completely separate issues? And if you want to see more deep dives into fascinating historical figures who don't fit into simple categories, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching.